The light in Widow's Cape Lighthouse has been dead for 3 years. I know this because I was the one who killed it. That's not a metaphor. I'm a marine electrician. I've spent the better part of a decade crawling through the guts of offshore platforms, decommissioned lightships, and corroded navigation beacons along the northern Atlantic seaboard. In November of 2020, the Coast Guard contracted me to strip the electrical system out of Widow's Cape Light as part of the regional decommission program. GPS had made the old towers redundant. One by one, they were going dark. I grew up in Prosper, the little fishing town that sits in the crook of the Cape like a barnacle in a joint. My father worked lobster out of Prosper Harbor until his back gave out. My older brother Nate still does. I left at 18 and didn't come back for a decade, except for holidays I mostly found reasons to cut short. It's not that I hated the town. It's that the town felt like a hand that was always reaching for your ankle. When I took the decommission job, it was mostly for the money. The Coast Guard pays well for certified offshore electrical work, and I told myself I'd see Nate while I was there. I spent 2 days on the islet. I disconnected the main power feed from the submarine cable, pulled the junction boxes, removed the lamp assembly and the rotating mechanism, and capped every conduit. I left the tower structurally intact, that was the spec, but electrically, the thing was a hollow concrete tube. No power in, no power out. I signed the completion certificate, filed it with the district office, and drove back to Portland. That should have been the end of it. Nate called me 14 months later, in January of 2022. It was a Tuesday night, close to midnight, and the connection was bad because a nor'easter was hammering the coast. I could hear the wind screaming behind his voice. "Cal, the light's on." I told him that wasn't possible. I'd pulled everything myself. There was nothing left to turn on. "I'm looking at it right now," he said. "I'm standing on the dock and I'm looking right at it. It's not the old pattern. It's not rotating. It's pulsing. Like it's talking." I told him it was probably a reflection. Lightning on wet glass. Some optical trick of the storm. He got quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yeah. Probably." But the way he said it, flat, rehearsed, like he'd already told himself that answer and it hadn't stuck, that bothered me more than the claim itself. He called again a month later, after another storm. Same thing. Light in the tower, pulsing. Not the old sweep pattern, not a malfunction strobe, but something deliberate. Irregular intervals, varying intensity, like someone flicking a lamp on and off with purpose. This time he'd filmed it on his phone. The video was garbage, rain on the lens, shaky hands, the islet just a dark shape against a darker sea, but there was light in the tower. A cold, pale glow that bloomed and faded and bloomed again in a rhythm that looked, I'll admit, nothing like a reflection. I told him I'd look into it. I didn't. Over the next year, Nate called less often but said more each time. He'd started keeping notebooks. He'd timed the pulses with a stopwatch and transcribed them into number sequences. He'd cross-reference storm dates with old maritime logs he'd found in the Prosper Library. He told me the patterns matched no known signaling system, not Morse, not the International Code, not any lighthouse characteristic ever registered with the Coast Guard. But they were consistent. The same sequences repeated across storms, with variations he believed were responsive. Responsive to what? I asked. I don't know yet, he said. But it changes when I'm watching. The rhythm shifts. Like it knows. That was the call that scared me. Not because I believed him. Because Nate is the most level-headed person I've ever known. He's the kind of man who checks the tide tables before he trusts the water, who replaces his rigging on a calendar schedule, who has never once in his life made a decision based on a feeling. Hearing him talk about a lighthouse that knew he was watching, that was like hearing a steel beam describe the moment it started to bend. I called Ellen, his wife. She was careful about what she said, the way people are when they love someone and are afraid of what the truth sounds like out loud. She told me Nate wasn't sleeping well. He'd lost weight. He'd stopped going out on the boat some days, which was unheard of. Nate hadn't missed a day on the water since he was 16 unless he was physically unable to stand. She said he spent storms on the dock with his binoculars and his notebooks, and when he came inside he'd sit at the kitchen table and write for hours, filling pages with numbers and diagrams she didn't understand. He's not drinking, she said, as though she'd been asked. He's not on anything. He's just, somewhere else. Even when he's sitting right next to me, he's out there. I drove down the next weekend. Prosper looked worse than I remembered. The harbor had always been weathered, but now it looked exhausted. Half the slips were empty. The bait shop on Chandler Street was closed, plywood over the windows. The grocery had thinned its shelves. I passed maybe 6 people on the drive from the highway to Nate's house, and every one of them looked like they were walking in their sleep. Nate met me at the door. He'd dropped at least 30 pounds since I'd seen him last. His eyes had that bright, focused look you see in people who've been awake too long, not manic, exactly, but running on something other than rest. He hugged me hard and pulled me inside. His kitchen table was covered in notebooks. Composition books, the black and white marbled kind, stacked in a grid. Each one had a date range written on the spine in Nate's careful block letters. I picked one up and opened it. Pages of numbers, written in tight columns, timestamps in one column, durations in the next, then a third column of symbols I didn't recognize, combinations of dots, dashes, and circles that looked like a private language. What are the circles? I asked. Pauses that aren't pauses, he said, as if that explained anything. The light goes dark, but the dark isn't empty. It's a held note. You can feel the difference if you watch long enough. I set the notebook down. Nate. I pulled the wiring out of that tower myself. There's no circuit to close. There's no lamp to light. Whatever you're seeing, it isn't the lighthouse working. I know, he said. That's what makes it interesting. I slept in Nate's guest room that night. Around 2 in the morning, the wind picked up. Not a real storm, just a late winter squall, the kind the Cape gets a dozen times a season. I lay in bed and listened to the house creak and the rain rattle the siding, and I told myself I wasn't going to get up and look. I got up and looked. From the guest room window, you can see the Cape and the islet beyond it if the air is clear. It wasn't clear, rain smeared the glass and the sea was a black wall, but I could see the lighthouse. Not the tower itself. The light. A pale, cold luminescence in the lantern room, brightening and dimming in slow, deliberate intervals. It wasn't the warm amber of the old incandescent lamp. It was the color of deep water under moonlight, a blue-white that seemed to come from everywhere inside the glass at once. I watched for 20 minutes. The pattern wasn't random. I could feel the rhythm of it even without a stopwatch, the way you can feel the meter of a song in a language you don't speak. It pulsed. It held. It pulsed again. And then, I can't explain this in a way that doesn't sound insane, it stuttered. A quick, broken flicker, like someone losing their train of thought. And then it resumed in a different rhythm. Faster. More urgent. I realized I'd pressed my hand flat against the window glass. I pulled it away. My palm was ice cold, and the print I'd left on the glass was fogged not from warmth but from moisture that seemed to have come from the other side. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I told Nate I wanted to go out to the islet. He studied my face for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, relief, maybe. The relief of a man who's been screaming into a room and finally hears an echo. I'll take you today, he said. Water's calm enough after last night. But Cal, I need you to see it for yourself before you decide it's nothing. Actually stand inside the tower. Because I've been inside, and it's not nothing. We took his boat out after breakfast. The islet is a hump of dark granite about a quarter mile off the tip of the Cape, connected to the mainland by a submerged reef that shows its spine at low tide. The lighthouse stands at the highest point, a white concrete tower, maybe 60 feet tall, with a red-capped lantern room and an iron gallery rail. From a distance, it looked the same as it always had. Up close, I noticed the door was ajar. "Did you leave it open?" I asked. "I've never opened it," Nate said. "It's been like that since at least last spring." The interior was as I'd left it during the decommission. Bare concrete walls. The iron spiral staircase winding up through the center. Empty conduit brackets where I'd pulled the wiring. No fixtures, no junction boxes, no panel. At the base, the main feed conduit was still capped and sealed with the marine epoxy I'd applied myself. I checked the cap. Solid. No sign of tampering. We climbed the stairs. The lantern room at the top was stripped. I'd removed the Fresnel lens assembly and the lamp housing, shipped them to the Coast Guard depot in Boston. What remained was an empty glass enclosure, the iron frame that had held the lens, and the concrete pedestal. Nothing else. Except. The pedestal was warm. Not sun-warmed, the sky was overcast and the glass was cold. The concrete pedestal was radiating heat from within, a steady, low warmth like a body that had been sitting there recently and left. I put both hands flat on it. The warmth was real and it was even, distributed through the concrete as though the whole structure was a conductor for something beneath it. "Feel the floor," Nate said. I knelt down. The lantern room floor was warm too. Not just warm, faintly vibrating, a hum so low it was almost below perception, felt in the bones of my hands rather than heard. "It's stronger during storms," Nate said. "During last month's nor'easter, I stood up here and the whole tower was resonating. The glass was singing. And the light," he pointed at the empty pedestal. "It was coming from below. Up through the pedestal, through the concrete, like the whole tower was a wick." I climbed back down and went outside. The base of the lighthouse sits on the granite bedrock of the islet, and the original builders had cut a foundation shelf directly into the rock. I walked the perimeter, looking at the joint between concrete and stone. On the seaward side, facing away from the mainland, I found something I didn't remember from the decommission. A crack. Not in the concrete, in the granite itself. A fissure about 2 inches wide and maybe 4 feet long, running roughly parallel to the tower's foundation. It hadn't been there 3 years ago. I would have noted it in my report. Foundation integrity was part of the inspection checklist. The crack was new, or it had been hidden and something had opened it. I got down on my hands and knees and looked into it. The fissure went deeper than the daylight could reach. Air was moving through it, a slow, steady exhalation, warm and faintly saline, like breath from a mouth that tasted of the sea. And deep inside, at the very limit of what I could see, there was a glow. Not bright. Not steady. Just a suggestion of pale luminescence, far down in the rock, like light reflected off water in a cave. I sat back on my heels and looked at Nate, who was standing behind me with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone else to see what he's been seeing. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "Since September. I found it after Hurricane Lena. The crack was smaller then. It's been growing. What's down there? I don't know. But the light comes from there, Cal. Not from the tower. The tower just channels it. Like a chimney." I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to give him the electrician's answer, some geothermal explanation, some chemical luminescence, some completely rational physical process that would let me close this door and walk away. But I'd felt the warmth in the pedestal. I'd felt the vibration in the floor. And I'd seen the light from my window, pulsing in rhythms that no geological process I'd ever heard of could produce. We went back to Prosper. I stayed 3 more days. During that time, I did what I do for a living, I researched the infrastructure. I pulled the original construction records from the county clerk's office, the lighthouse was built in 1871, replacing a previous wooden tower that had burned in 1869. Before the wooden tower, there was a stone cairn with an oil lamp, maintained by a local family since at least the 1790s. Before that, the records got thin. But in the Prosper Historical Society's collection, a single glass case in the back of the library, I found a journal entry from a whaling captain named Ezra Collis, dated 1762, that described a pale fire upon the black rock at the mouth of the cape, seen in tempests and attributed by the Indians to the breathing of a sleeper beneath the stone. A sleeper beneath the stone. I read that line 4 times, standing in the fluorescent light of the Prosper Library, and each time the words meant exactly what they said. I found Harlan Briggs on the third day. Harlan was 86 years old and had fished out of Prosper his entire life, like his father before him. He lived in a saltbox on the hill behind the harbor, and when I knocked on his door he looked at me with the resigned patience of a man who'd been expecting this visit for years. "You're the Morrow boy," he said. "The electrician. Not the fisherman." "That's right. And your brother's been watching the light." I nodded. Harlan let me in. His house smelled like wood smoke and salt and the particular mustiness of a home where a person has been living alone for a long time. He made instant coffee and set it in front of me at a table that was scarred with decades of fish cleaning. "Your brother isn't the first," Harlan said. "Won't be the last. Every generation or so, someone starts watching. It's usually the fishermen. The ones who spend enough time on the water to feel when something underneath shifts. Your father felt it too, toward the end. Never talked about it, but I saw him looking." "My father?" "He used to sit on the breakwater during storms." "Your mother thought he was checking his pots." "He wasn't." I set down my coffee. "Harlan, what's under the lighthouse?" He looked at me for a long time. Not deciding whether to tell me, deciding how much. "I don't know what it is," he said. "Nobody does. It's been there longer than the town. Longer than the lighthouse or the cairn or whatever came before. The Micmac wouldn't camp on the cape. They said the rock breathed and the breath attracted things from deep water. They didn't go near it, and they said anyone who did would start to hear it in their sleep." "Hear what?" "The rhythm. The pulse. Whatever it does when it's dreaming." Harlan wrapped his hands around his mug. His knuckles were swollen with arthritis, the skin mapped with scars. The lighthouse keepers knew. Not the Coast Guard keepers, the ones before. The Pratt family, who kept the cairn and then the wooden tower. They didn't maintain the light to warn ships. They maintained it to regulate the signal. Regulate it? Keep it steady. The fire on the cairn, the oil lamp, the incandescent light, they imposed a pattern on the glow from below. Gave it a rhythm that was regular. Predictable. Safe. Like putting a metronome on top of a heartbeat. Without the light, the glow does what it wants. And what it wants isn't regular. What happens when it's irregular? Harlan looked out his window toward the harbor. Things come in from deep water. Fish, at first. Strange ones, species nobody's seen before, pulled up in nets or washing onto the beach. Then bigger things. And the people who've been watching the light start going out to the islet. Not because they want to. Because the rhythm gets inside them and they feel like they're being called. I thought of Nate on the dock with his binoculars and his notebooks, his careful columns of numbers, his circles that represented pauses that aren't pauses. I thought of him saying it changes when I'm watching, like it knows. How do I make it stop? I asked. Harlan almost laughed. You don't make it stop, son. You can't turn off a heartbeat that was going before your species learned to stack stones. The Pratts understood that. They didn't try to stop it. They played along with it. They gave it a rhythm it could follow, and it settled. When the Coast Guard automated the light, it still worked, the bulbs cycled on a timer, close enough to the old pattern. But now there's nothing up there. You took the last of it out yourself. So I put a light back in. You could try. But the crack is open now. It was always hairline before, the Pratts kept it sealed with pitch, and the foundation builders poured over it in '71. Something's shifted. The gap is bigger than it's been in anyone's lifetime, and the rhythm is, he paused, searching for the word. Reaching. It's reaching further than it used to. I left Harlan's house with the feeling of a man who has opened a fuse box and found not wires but roots. I drove back to Portland that night. I told Nate I'd be back. I told him to stay off the islet. He promised he would, and I knew he was lying, and he knew I knew, and neither of us said anything about it. For 3 months, I researched from a distance. I pulled every historical document I could find on Widow's Cape, the Lighthouse, and the Pratt family. Most of it was mundane: supply records, maintenance logs, keepers' journals full of weather observations and ship sightings. But threaded through the mundane record, like a dark filament in clean rope, was a pattern. Every 30 to 40 years, there was a cluster of incidents. Boats lost near the Cape in calm weather. Fishermen who walked into the water during storms and were never found. Families who left Prosper suddenly and without explanation, leaving behind houses full of furniture and pantries full of food, as if they'd simply stood up one day and walked away from their lives. And in each cluster, there was a keeper, a Pratt, usually, or later a Coast Guard appointee, who reported the light behaving erratically. The last cluster was in the early 1980s. 4 boats lost. 2 men walked into the sea. The Coast Guard keeper at the time, a man named Dennis Ulrich, filed a series of increasingly frantic reports about the light activating outside its programmed cycle and producing patterns he couldn't explain. His final report, submitted 3 days before he was found dead of hypothermia on the islet's shore in January 1983, contained a single sentence that the Coast Guard classified as evidence of mental illness: the light is not a signal. It is a summons. I can no longer determine whether it is calling something up or calling us down. I found that report in a FOIA archive. I read it at 2 in the morning in my apartment in Portland, and I sat there in the dark for a long time afterward, listening to the rain and thinking about my brother standing on a dock with a stopwatch, transcribing the language of something that had been dreaming under a rock since before the town existed. I called Nate the next morning. Ellen answered. She'd been crying. He went out last night, she said. During the storm. He took the boat to the islet. He was gone for 6 hours. When he came back he was soaking wet and shaking, and he wouldn't tell me what happened. He just sat at the table and wrote. He's still writing. Put him on. He won't come to the phone. Cal, please. I don't know what to do anymore. I was in my truck within the hour. The drive from Portland to Prosper is about 3 hours if you push it. I pushed it. When I got there, Nate was sitting at the kitchen table exactly as Ellen had described. His clothes were dry now but stiff with salt. His notebooks were open in front of him and he was writing fast, filling pages with symbols that were no longer the dots and dashes of his early transcriptions but something more fluid, curves and loops and spirals that looked less like notation and more like a script, as if the pattern had evolved beyond simple code and into language. He looked up when I walked in. His eyes were clear. That was the worst part. He wasn't delirious or manic or glazed. He was lucid. He was calm. He looked like a man who had finally found the answer to a question that had been eating him alive, and the answer was something he couldn't unsee. I went under, Cal, he said. Under what? The lighthouse. There's a cavity beneath the foundation. The crack's wide enough to get through now. I went in. I sat down across from him. Ellen was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, and I could feel her wanting me to say something that would fix this, some magic sentence that would reach past whatever had gotten into my brother and pull him back. I didn't have one. What did you see? I asked. Nate set down his pen. He flexed his fingers. They were trembling, not from cold but from the fine, controlled tremor of exhaustion. The cavity goes down about 40 feet through the granite. It's not natural, or it is, but something's shaped it. Smoothed it. The walls are polished and there are grooves cut into them, spiraling downward. At the bottom, there's water. Tidal, it rises and falls with the sea. It connects to the ocean through fissures in the bedrock. Okay. The water glows. From below. The same light that comes through the tower. When the storm was hitting, the glow was intense, bright enough to see by, bright enough to read by. And it pulsed. The same rhythm I've been tracking for 2 years, Cal, but down there it wasn't just light. It was pressure. I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth, like standing next to a speaker playing a note too low to hear. He picked up one of his notebooks and opened it to a page near the end. The symbols on it were denser than anything I'd seen before, packed tight and layered over each other. The grooves in the walls matched the rhythm. They're carved in a spiral pattern that matches the pulse intervals. Whoever made them, and someone made them, Cal, they're too regular to be erosion, they were encoding the signal into the stone. It's the same thing the Pratts were doing with the cairn fire. The same thing the lighthouse was doing with the lamp. Giving it structure. Giving it a channel. Nate. What's at the bottom of the water? His eyes shifted. Just slightly. Just enough that I knew he'd seen something he hadn't decided how to say. I didn't go in the water, he said. But you saw something. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind was picking up again. Another system moving in. The Cape gets them in chains this time of year, one after another, like something keeps sending them. There's a shape, he said finally. In the water. Below the glow. It's large. It's not, it doesn't move the way things move. It shifts. Like heat haze. Like something that's only partly physical, or partly here. I watched it for maybe 20 minutes, and in that time it changed shape 3 times. Not like an animal moving. Like a thought changing. And the signals? The glow pulses from it. It's the source. Everything else, the grooves, the tower, the cairn, all of it, is just amplification. Relay. This thing produces a signal, and for centuries, people have been building structures on top of it to channel that signal upward and outward. Why? Nate closed the notebook. I think it's sleeping. I think the signal is what it does when it's asleep. And I think the structures, the fire, the light, the tower, were built to keep the signal regular. To keep it dreaming peacefully. Because when the signal goes irregular, it starts to wake up. The second storm hit that night. I'd planned to go out to the islet myself during daylight, in calm conditions, to see the cavity and make my own assessment. But the storm came in fast, a full gale, 60-knot gusts, the harbor white with spray, and it brought something else with it. I was in the guest room when it started. Not the wind, not the rain. A sound. Low, pervasive, coming from everywhere and nowhere, felt more than heard. A pulse. The same rhythm I'd seen in the lighthouse light, translated into vibration, coming up through the foundation of Nate's house, through the bedrock, through the earth itself. The whole Cape was resonating. I went downstairs. Nate was already at the door, dressed, boots on, rain gear in hand. Ellen was behind him, holding his arm. Don't go, she said. Please, Nate. Not tonight. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was something I never want to see on another person. It was tenderness and apology and a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with compulsion. He was being called. Not metaphorically. The rhythm was in him, I could see it in the pulse at his throat, in the micro-movements of his fingers, in the way his breathing had synced to the vibration in the floor. I have to, he said. Then I'm going with you, I said. He looked at me. Surprised, maybe. Or grateful. It was hard to tell with the way his face kept shifting between the brother I knew and the stranger he was becoming. Cal. I'm a marine electrician, Nate. If there's something down there that produces light and vibration, I'm the closest thing to qualified that either of us is going to get. And I'm not letting you go alone. Ellen looked at me with something that was either gratitude or betrayal. Maybe both. I just validated her husband's obsession by joining it. We took Nate's boat. The crossing was brutal, a quarter-mile in a full gale, waves breaking over the bow, the outboard screaming against the current. The lighthouse was visible from the moment we cleared the harbor wall, and what I saw made my hands go cold on the tiller. The entire tower was glowing. Not just the lantern room, the whole structure, foundation to gallery, radiating that pale blue-white luminescence from within, as if the concrete had become translucent and something behind it was blazing. The light pulsed in the rhythm I'd felt through the floorboards, but here, on the open water, the rhythm was so strong I could feel it in my blood. My heart was trying to sync with it. Every third beat, my pulse would stumble, skip, and then lock into the pattern for a moment before my autonomic system wrenched it back. We tied up at the islet's small concrete landing. The rain was horizontal and cold and the rock was slick, but we made it to the tower's base. The crack in the granite that I'd seen on my previous visit was no longer a crack. It was a gap, wide enough for a man to slide through sideways, maybe 2 feet across and 5 feet tall, splitting the bedrock like a wound. Warm air poured out of it in steady exhalations, and the glow from below was bright enough to cast shadows. Nate went first. I followed. The cavity was as he'd described it, but description hadn't prepared me. The walls were polished smooth, the granite glassy and dark, and the spiral grooves cut into them were deep enough to put my fingers in. They wound downward in a pattern that matched the pulsing light precisely, each groove's width and depth corresponding to the duration and intensity of a pulse. It was notation. Carved into living rock. And it was old. The edges of the grooves were softened by what must have been centuries of tidal erosion, and in places they were overlaid with newer cuts, sharper and deeper, as if someone had been maintaining them. Updating them. Transcribing revisions from the source. We descended. The air was warm and wet and tasted of salt and something else, something mineral and ancient, like the smell of a cave that has never seen daylight. The glow intensified as we went down, and so did the vibration. At 30 feet below the surface, the pulse was a physical force, a compression wave that squeezed my chest with every beat. My vision blurred at the edges. My thoughts felt thick and slow, as if the rhythm was displacing them, making room for itself inside my skull. At the bottom, we hit water. Black water, still and warm, filling the cavity from wall to wall. The glow came from beneath it, a light source somewhere below the waterline, deep enough that the water diffused it into a soft, even radiance. The surface was mirror-flat despite the storm raging 60 feet above us, and it reflected the spiral grooves on the walls in a pattern that looked, from directly above, like a vast and intricate eye. And beneath the surface, I saw it. Nate had called it a shape. That was generous. It was more like a presence, an area of the water where the glow was denser, where the light seemed to have weight and texture. It shifted as I watched, contracting and expanding in time with the pulse, and each shift produced a different configuration. Not random. Iterative. Like watching something think. The light coming off the water was strong enough to illuminate the entire cavity, and in that light I noticed something on the walls that I'd missed on the way down. Between the spiral grooves, covering every inch of available surface, were marks. Not grooves, scratches. Made by human hands. Thousands of them. Some were tally marks. Some were names. Some were dates. And some, near the waterline, were messages. I leaned close enough to read one. It was scratched into the granite with something sharp, the letters crude but legible. April 1847, the dreamer stirs, we must feed the rhythm or it will feed itself, T. Pratt. Another, lower. September 1911, God forgive me, I have been coming here for 3 years and I cannot stop, the song is in my marrow, H. Pratt. And another, almost at the waterline, in handwriting I recognized because I'd seen it in the Coast Guard FOIA file. January 1983, IT is not calling something up. It is calling US down. I understand now. I am going to go down. D.U. Dennis Ulrich. The Last Keeper. Found dead of hypothermia on the shore. But he hadn't died of cold, had he? He'd gone down into the water and the cold had been what came after. Nate was standing at the water's edge. The glow from below lit his face from beneath, carving shadows upward, and in that inverted light he looked like someone I'd never met. His lips were moving. Not speaking, shaping. Forming the rhythm of the pulse with his mouth, his jaw working in time with the compressions, as if he were learning to speak a language that used pressure instead of sound. Nate. He didn't respond. Nate. We need to go. He looked at me then, and his eyes were full of something that I can only describe as recognition. Not of me. Of the thing in the water. He was recognizing it the way you recognize a face you've been dreaming about, the shock of seeing something real that you thought existed only inside your head. It's been alone, he said. For so long, Cal, longer than anything should be alone. It doesn't want to hurt anyone. It just wants to be heard. The signal, it's not a summons. It's a voice. It's been talking this whole time and nobody's been listening. Not really. The Pratts tried to control it. The keepers tried to regulate it. But nobody ever just listened. You need to step back from the water. I can feel it. In my chest. In my pulse. It's synced with me. We're breathing together. I grabbed his arm. His skin was hot, fever hot, burning through his rain gear, and the vibration I felt through his body was not the ambient pulse of the cavity. It was his own pulse, beating in perfect synchronization with the glow beneath the water. His heart had locked into the rhythm and wasn't fighting it anymore. The surface of the water began to move. Not waves, displacement. Something was rising. The shape beneath the glow was consolidating, gathering density, and the water above it was bulging upward in a slow, smooth dome, as if pushed by a vast and gentle hand. The light intensified. The pulse deepened. And the walls of the cavity began to vibrate at a frequency I could hear now, a tone, low and immense, that wasn't sound but was close enough to sound that my brain tried to interpret it as one. It sounded like a name being spoken by a mouth the size of the ocean floor. Nate pulled free of my grip. Not violently, he just stepped forward, out of my hand, the way you step through a doorway you've been standing in front of for too long. He walked to the edge of the water and he didn't stop. The water took him without a splash. It folded around his legs, his waist, his chest, warm and luminous and welcoming, and he sank into it with the expression of a man stepping into a bath he'd been craving his whole life. The glow enveloped him. The pulse accelerated, 3 beats, 4, 5, faster than a human heart should follow, and then it slowed. Way down. To a pace that felt geological. The pace of tides. Of tectonics. Of things that move on scales where human lifetimes are rounding errors. I screamed his name. I lunged for the water. And I stopped. Because in the moment before Nate's head went under, the glow beneath the surface flared, a single, blinding pulse that lit the entire cavity like daylight, and in that flash I saw it. Not a shape. Not a presence. The thing itself. Vast and intricate and utterly incomprehensible, curled in the rock beneath the seabed like a fist inside a glove, its body threaded through the geology of the cape like mycelium through soil. It was alive. It was aware. And it was looking at me. Not with eyes. With attention. With a focus so total and so alien that the weight of it nearly drove me to my knees. For 1 second, one single, stretched, eternal second, I felt what Nate must have been feeling for months. The rhythm, inside me. Synchronized. My heartbeat, my breathing, the electrical firing of my neurons, all of it locked into a pattern that was not mine. And in that second, I understood the signal. It wasn't a summons. It wasn't a language. It was a heartbeat. The thing beneath the rock had a heartbeat, and when there was nothing to regulate it, no fire, no lamp, no light, that heartbeat radiated outward through the stone and the water and the air, and anything alive that felt it long enough would begin to sink. Would begin to fall into rhythm with something so much older and larger than itself that the synchronization felt like love. Like belonging. Like finally, after a lifetime of noise, hearing the one true note that everything else was a distortion of. I understood why the Pratts had built the cairn. Why the lighthouse was erected. Why every keeper for 2 centuries had maintained the light not as a navigation aid but as a pacemaker. The imposed rhythm of the lamp kept the heartbeat steady, kept it at a frequency that human biology could resist. Without the light, the heartbeat found its own rhythm. And its own rhythm was irresistible. I also understood why I had to break the synchronization right now, in this second, before it settled into my bones the way it had settled into Nate's. Because the second of connection had shown me something else, too, a glimpse of the shape of the things dreaming, and in that dream, there was no malice but there was also no recognition of the boundary between itself and the living things above it. It absorbed. Not with hunger. With gravity. The way a planet absorbs a stone. Simply, automatically, by virtue of being so much more massive that everything nearby falls inward. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. The pain broke the rhythm. My heart stuttered, stammered, and found its own pattern again, fast and ragged and gloriously out of sync. I did not go into the water after my brother. I climbed out of the cavity. I crossed the islet in the screaming wind. I got into the boat and I went back to Prosper. I sat in Nate's kitchen across from Ellen and I told her that Nate had gone into the water and I hadn't been able to stop him. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She nodded, slowly, as if she'd been preparing for this sentence for months, assembling the emotional architecture to bear its weight. Then she said, "Are you going to go back for him?" I didn't know how to answer that. The honest answer was that there was nothing to go back for. The thing beneath the lighthouse didn't take people the way a predator takes prey. It took them the way a current takes a leaf. Nate was part of it now. Part of the rhythm. Part of the dreaming. Getting him back would be like getting a note back out of a song after it's been sung. What I could do, what I had to do, was put the pacemaker back. I drove to Portland that night and I broke into the Coast Guard depot. The old Fresnel lens from Widow's Cape was in storage, crated and tagged, along with the lamp assembly I'd pulled during the decommission. I loaded them into my truck. I also took a marine generator, 500 feet of heavy-gauge cable, and enough fuel to run the system for a month. It took me 4 days to reinstall the light. I worked in calm weather, ferrying equipment to the islet on Nate's boat. I sealed the crack in the granite with marine epoxy and hydraulic cement, 4 inches thick, reinforced with rebar I hammered into the bedrock. I rebuilt the electrical system from the generator up, wired the lamp assembly back into the lantern room, and mounted the Fresnel lens on the pedestal. I programmed the rotation mechanism to the old characteristic, the original 3-second flash, 2-second eclipse pattern that the lighthouse had used since 1871. When I turned it on, the effect was immediate. The ambient vibration, that low, pervasive pulse that had been humming through the Cape's bedrock, smoothed. Steadied. Locked into the imposed rhythm of the lamp. Within an hour, the warmth in the pedestal faded. The glow from the sealed crack dimmed and died. The lighthouse was doing what it had always been designed to do. Not warning ships. Keeping time. Regulating a heartbeat that would otherwise beat in a rhythm that human bodies couldn't resist. I filed a false report with the Coast Guard, claiming structural concerns required the temporary reactivation of the light. I set the generator to auto-refuel from a tank I'd installed in the tower's base. I calculated about 6 months of runtime before someone would need to come out and service it. Then I went back to Prosper. I told Ellen what I'd done. I told Harlan. I told them the light needed to stay on, not forever, but until someone figured out a permanent solution. Harlan nodded as if I'd confirmed something he'd known since he was a boy. Ellen stared at the table and said nothing for a long time, and then she asked me if the light being on meant Nate was still down there. I told her I didn't know. That was the truth. I left Prosper the next day. I drove north, toward Portland, with the windows down despite the cold because I needed air that tasted like highway and exhaust and the ordinary world. I took Route 1 because the highway felt too fast, and the coast road wound through towns that were alive in the normal, boring, beautiful way that towns are alive, people pumping gas and arguing in parking lots and walking dogs that pulled at their leashes. 40 miles out, the sky darkened. A squall line, moving in from the northeast. Spring storm, nothing unusual. I watched the clouds stack and darken and felt the first fat drops hit the windshield, and I kept driving. An hour later, the storm was a full gale. I pulled over near a scenic overlook because the visibility was down to nothing and the wind was shoving my truck sideways. I sat in the cab with the engine running and the wipers on full and I waited it out. When the rain eased enough to see, I looked at the view from the overlook. The coast. Rocky headland stretching south. And there, at the far edge of sight, maybe 30 miles back, maybe more, a pale light on the water. Pulsing. Not the old 3-flash pattern. Not the rhythm I'd programmed. Something irregular. Something urgent. Something that I could feel, even at this distance, even through 30 miles of air and rain and granite, pressing gently against the inside of my chest like a hand on a door. I put the truck in gear. I pulled onto the road. The light pulsed behind me. I watched it in the rearview mirror, small and cold and patient, and I tried not to count the intervals. I tried not to notice that they matched my breathing. I made it another 10 miles before I realized I was no longer driving away from Prosper. At some point, I don't know when, I'd turned the truck around. I was heading south. Back toward the Cape. Back toward the light. And my hands on the wheel felt steady and sure, and my heartbeat was slow and even, and the rhythm in my chest felt less like a threat and more like a direction. I pulled over again. I sat there with my hands shaking and my breath ragged and the windshield blurring with rain. I turned the truck around. North. Away. I made myself drive. But here's the thing that I need you to understand, the thing that I'm writing this down to say before I lose the ability to say it clearly, the pull didn't stop. It hasn't stopped. It's been 4 months since I left Prosper, and every time it storms, I feel it. A gentle, patient tug behind my sternum, like a tide in my blood. My heart rate drops. My breathing slows. And somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the noise of daily life, I hear the rhythm. It's getting easier to hear. Last week, I woke up at 3 in the morning during a thunderstorm and found myself standing at my apartment door with my car keys in my hand and my shoes on. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember putting on the shoes. I was just there, hand on the doorknob, ready to drive south, and the only thing that stopped me was that the storm passed and the rhythm faded enough for me to recognize what I was doing. I called Ellen yesterday. She told me the generator on the islet ran dry 3 weeks ago. No one has gone out to refuel it. The light is off. But during last Tuesday's storm, she said, the tower was glowing again. The old glow. The irregular pulse. And she said something else, something that made me set down the phone and sit very still for a long time. She said she'd gone out to the dock during the storm. She doesn't know why. She said she stood there in the rain and looked at the light, and for just a moment, in the pause between 2 pulses, she saw a figure on the islet. Standing on the rocks near the tower's base. Facing the mainland. Facing her. She said it looked like Nate. She said it waved. There's a storm coming tonight. I can see it on the radar, a tight spiral of green and yellow moving up the coast. It'll hit Portland around midnight. My truck is gassed up. My keys are on the counter. I've written this down because I think tonight is the night I stop fighting the current, and I want someone to know why. Not because I'm afraid. That's the part that scares me most. I'm not afraid anymore. The rhythm in my chest is steady and warm, and it feels like the most natural thing in the world, like a song I've been trying to remember my whole life and have finally, almost, got. I think Nate was right. It doesn't want to hurt anyone. It's just so much bigger than us that our wanting and not wanting don't register on the scale it operates on. It's a heartbeat. And everything within range of a heartbeat eventually sinks. My keys are on the counter. The storm is coming. And somewhere south of here, on a dark rock in a dark sea, a light is beginning to pulse. I just want to hear the rest of the song.